you so much. Unbelievable. That's the first time that I've started to talk with applause in advance, so now I feel very nervous. So thank you so much, Dimitri. Yes, indeed. For today, I'm going to talk about what I call the clash of values in modern legal systems. So it's about a relationship between law and culture, which I approached sociologically from the viewpoint of sociology of law. And so I have to talk a little bit about sociological theories, but don't worry, right? I will make it very concrete. So what is it that we talk about when we talk about law, and what is it that we talk about when we talk about culture? And in English, and there are comparative terms in Japanese, it's about a relationship between norms and values. And that is very, very important, norms and values. Because oftentimes, I know in the United States, and maybe in Japanese it's similar too, we tend to sometimes mix up those terms, but they have very precise meanings, and it's definitely not the same. Values and norms, it's a very, 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 very important issue in our society today, and that's what I'm going to talk about, okay? So I'm going to talk about the relationship between law and culture in the United States today, and what are some of the specific legal issues that are going on in the United States today and that have roots in important cultural differences. I have to tell you a little bit about what is sociology of law. And one of the key issues is this: what is sociology in general? Sociology in general can be defined as the scientific study of society, right? So when a sociologist is interested in any one particular issue that is a dimension of society, they do so from the viewpoint of a broader interest in society as a whole. So in other words, if you're interested in law from a sociological point of view, you're interested in the role of law, this is a very important word, the law in society. And I know, if some of you probably know, in the United States we routinely refer to the kind of legal studies that you do in a faculty of law program as law and society. Have you heard the expression? Law, maybe in Japanese you say the same thing. Law and society. This makes no sense to say that, because it assumes that law is not already part of society. So it is law and the rest of society, so it's about a relationship of law to other dimensions, other institutions in society. This is the table of contents in my book where I apply that same model. Then we have the thematic chapters, and that is here. And what do you see? The different chapters are always about the relationship between law and something else. Law and economy, law and politics, law and integration, you know what this is? And law and culture. Law and integration is the primary function of law itself is integration. So, in other words, it's about the internal relationships in law itself. So this is the model. And what the table is this is society. Are you with me? Because society has to be something. As soon as you say society, it means something is society and some is not. Something is not society. So it has certain boundaries. That's the boundary. This is society. And then what I'm interested in is the relationship between culture and law, the relationship between values and norms. And so that goes indeed two ways. You see, the relationships are always multiple ways, right? So you could draw arrows all over the place. And so we are interested in this. And it's a double arrow. So to some extent, the legal system might change the cultural system, which it does. I have very good example of that today. But to another extent, certain changes in the value system affect the legal system and how the legal system tries to accommodate for these differences and changes. Why do we study culture? Because my point of view is sociology of law. So what I'm saying is that today, more than ever before, if you're interested in law from a sociological point of view, if you're interested in law in society, you have to study culture. So culture is important, and theoretically, culture has been studied throughout sociological theory as well. The first sociologist to draw a lot of attention to culture is this person. This is Emil Durkheim. He said, ultimately, the change in our society towards a modern society is a change about a society that is held together, how? By common beliefs. These are small-scale societies. Everybody thinks the same thing, like a tribal society or a totemic society. It's small, everybody's the same. Our society is very big and everybody has different values. A lot of people have different ideas on all kinds of things. Some people have long hair, some people have short hair, some people like to wear a suit, some people don't like to wear a suit, but they think it's appropriate to do it, right? So they do it on occasions, all kinds of things. Some people believe in one religion, some people believe in another religion. Some people have values about the termination of a pregnancy that differ very much from other people's values about the termination of a pregnancy. So you see, the differences can be very important. And according to Durkheim, this change in society is ultimately culturally driven. So this is the exact opposite than what who said? Karl Marx. You know Karl Marx? Yeah? Marx is actually, so Marx wrote about 40, 50 years before Durkheim, and Marx said the changes in society are all economic, right? So it's basically about the change into a capitalist system, and this economic change brings about cultural changes. And Durkheim does the exact opposite. Durkheim says, no, there are cultural changes, and those bring about changes in the economic and indeed in the legal system. So in Durkheim, culture is very important. When we talk about culture, we talk about differences between values and norms. What are values? Values are conceptions of how one ought to live. What is it that I value to do? Let me show you the difference between norm. Look, value, what should you do? A norm is how should you interact? You see it? The first line. A value is what should I do? In other words, what should I do for myself? What is it that I value for myself? What kind of clothes should I wear? What is the way in which I should be a good parent? What does it mean to be a good parent? What does it mean to be a good teacher? What does it mean to be decent? What does it mean to be upstanding? And then it dictates to you how you should act. In terms of norms, it's all about interaction with others. That's why the legal system, the legal system is never about what should I do. The legal system is always about what should I do towards somebody else? What is a particular obligation? Like, for instance, if you sign a contract, right? Like, so most of you rent, is that correct? You rent an apartment or you rent a room. So you have signed a contract. And, the contract gives you the right to live someplace, but you also have to pay money for it. So there's a transaction involved. So values is what one is socialized into. For the legal system, it's all about integration. It's all about holding, people together, holding people with different beliefs, different value systems together. So this is very, very important. So I'm going to give you some examples on that, and obviously I'm going to talk about it in the case of the United States. But let me first talk about it theoretically. And these are indeed some of the most important theories. First of all, we have the classical tradition. See it? Classical theories. Classical theories are not only old. Classical means it's old, but it also means it's still relevant today. Do you understand? Yeah? Classical. If it was just old, I wouldn't talk about it. But if it's still relevant today, then it's classical. And that's why in sociology, we sometimes talk about theories that are more than 100 years old. It's not fetish, it's just because, it still has validity today. But at the same time, the period that we're roughly referring to is from the late 19th century up until about World War II. Right? The war was a bit of a moment that there was not much advanced for obvious reasons, right? Emil Durkheim says the following. Emil Durkheim says, on a cultural level, look, this is culture, the collective conscious. But Durkheim says, society also has a consciousness. He calls it the collective conscious. See? So the collective conscious is the culture of a society. And he says, in a modern society, it becomes very pluralistic. It becomes very diverse, he said, because there's a lot of individualism. And relatively speaking, tradition is less important. So tradition is less important and the self becomes more important. Now, this is very, very, very interesting discussion, which is still very, very, very important today, especially in the United States. And that is, as a result of these differences increasing more and more, there is less society. That was the idea. There are more individuals, but there is less society. And Durkheim says that is not true. Durkheim says all these differences today doesn't mean that there is less society, but that society is different. Are you with me? So there is not less society, because people say the individual is more important today than ever before. That is true. But that doesn't mean that there is less society, but a different kind of society. But he says, in our legal system, you can also have a new kind of law, which he calls restitutive law. Restitutive law means you have to provide restitution. Max Weber is the second classical theorist. For Weber, it's not so much about law, but about legal procedures. So Weber says, in a modern society like ours, what is very important in the legal system is that there is a particular procedure that you have to follow. Then we're going to do a modern example. The modern example is Talcott Parsons. So Talcott Parsons wrote about 50 years later than the classics. So Talcott Parsons, this is after World War II. And this is at a time, of course, when the United States had come victorious, quote unquote, after World War II, and was very prosperous in an economic sense, and was also, in a way, prosperous in a political sense. Right? So that's when you had a lot of expansion of rights in the United States. You had, obviously more, in a way you had more democracy in the United States than ever before. Like, for instance, there were court rulings about voting rights for racial minorities in the United States. And so these rights expanded more and more and more. So more and more and more people were included in the legal system. And Durkheim says it's one of the advantages of a liberal democracy. See? So now the culture modernizes, but in our days, what is a peculiar issue, now I'm again 50 years later, so now I'm talking about societies like today, so let's say since the 1980s, 1990s, we're talking about the last 30 years or so. What do you have? There is so much diversity within one society that there's a new level of complexity. You see, within one society. In the United States today, the level of diversity is really, really, really high, and the level of differences in cultural ideas is very high as well. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to apply it. So the rest of the talk, I'm going to do very concrete examples, okay? The cultural differences in the United States on some issues, very important issues, are so strong that a sociologist at some point wrote a book called The Cultural Wars. So it is as if people are fighting one another, like, military, like soldiers. And sometimes they do so indeed through violent means. What are those issues? What do they have to do with? Here are some of the issues involved. And I know some of these issues are probably also important in Japan, but some are not, I think. So that'd actually be interesting to see how it would work out in Japan. The issue that I'm going to talk about the most is abortion, right? And it's both about the culture and the law. So there is a particular legal regulation of abortion, right? And then there is, what do people think about abortion? So that's what I would call abortion culture. So abortion law abortion culture. That's very important for this class too, right? What do people think about law, about the validity of law? And in this case, it's more about the morality of law. Issues having to do with sexuality and gender, morality and religion, so we'll get to that too. Most of it will be about abortion. Abortion, which is a very important matter, is regulated at the level of the states. So in the United States, you have 50 state laws on abortion. There are 50 laws about abortion. However, these laws all have to abide by the Constitution. That's very important in the United States. So every state law has to apply by the Constitution, which is, determined by the Supreme Court, both at the state and the federal level. And what happened in this case, Roe v. Wade, was a decision by the Supreme Court at the federal level, which basically said that abortion was legal in the first 3 months of the pregnancy. Until 1973, abortion was illegal pretty much always, but in some states it was legal pretty much always. See, so there was a lot of diversity. And then since Roe v. Wade, abortion restrictions were basically lifted, definitely for the first 3 months. And then what happened is Planned Parenthood versus Casey, 1992, that was the next most important decision, and that's when the trimester framework was abolished. That then led more states to pass new laws, and some states passed laws that technically were still in the framework, but that effectively kind of overturned Roe v. Wade. You know what I mean? It's like you can have a law that says, we are not overturning Roe v. Wade, but any abortion, let's say after 4 weeks, is illegal. Well, it's very difficult to know because most women don't know whether they're pregnant or not at that early stage in fetal development. Are you with me? So then it was kind of effectively dead, some people say. So there was a very important new decision. You see the law responds to other developments. And then indeed, a year ago in Dobbs versus Jackson, the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade. So now Roe v. Wade is overturned, but not in the sense that abortion is now again illegal, but in the sense that the Supreme Court said the Constitution doesn't say anything about abortion, so it's up to the states. So now you have the situation that in some states, abortion will be basically legal, maybe even always legal, and in other states, abortion will be outlawed. So that is something that is obviously a very, very hot issue right now. When we talk about abortion culture, we do not talk about the laws that govern abortion. We talk about the opinions that people have about the morality of abortion, right? What do people think? What do people in general think about abortion? Do they think abortion should be legal? Do they think it should be illegal? Obviously, that would relate to the fact, do they think abortion is moral? Do they think abortion is a termination of life or not? Why? Because if it's life, it would be difficult to defend, and so on and so forth. So we have an entire abortion culture, and in the United States, the ideas revolving around abortion are very much here and there, meaning with a sharp line in between. This is not often the case, by the way. And this proliferation of pro-life versus pro-choice is very strong. And that is not obvious. Guess how that came about? Pro-life and pro-choice did not exist until 1973. So in 1973, when Roe v. Wade was decided, there were no such cultural divisions. They didn't exist. There was no pro-life and pro-choice movement. And so that's when you have the proliferation of this. You see these posters for keep abortion legal versus stop abortion now. Here you see, just to close it, what was very interesting about that Dobbs decision, have you heard of it? That decision leaked before it was officially announced. So this is a very, very serious breach, and actually they did an inquiry about it and they couldn't determine what had happened. But as a result, this was posted in this news website called Politico. Look, This is a report this is in The Guardian. They do, this is a British newspaper, but they do a lot of American reporting too. New peak in, culture wars, just this year. And then it turned out actually, this was reported all over the world. Maybe it was also in a Japanese newspaper. It mobilizes a lot of social action. The most recent ruling is this one. Look, this is just a few weeks ago, April 2023. So this happened when I was already here in Japan. This is an abortion pill. The abortion pill is what some women take after they've had unprotected sex, for instance, and they think they might be pregnant. And let's say technically, from a medical point of view, that would also be an abortion, because it would work after there has been a fertilization. And so the decision here was reached just, April 21. Abortion isn't the only issue. And what are some of those other conflicts that the legal system is responding to? So these are not just differences in values, these are not just differences in culture, these are differences in values and culture that have an effect on the legal system. What are some examples? Is this: there's a GOP bill to bar trans athletes on girls and women's teams. Do you have that issue in Japan too? So there are transgender women. So these are people who were born biological male, but who transgender, so who identify as a woman, and then they participate in sports. And then some people say, well, that's not fair. Because people who were born biological female in most sports that involve athletic achievement and physical prowess, they will lose. And there actually was such a famous case. So now there's a law that says, well, you can be trans, but you cannot participate in women's sport. This is actually a person who's become something of an activist on this issue. This woman, this is somebody who is called cisgender woman, right? So she was born biologically female. And in the United States, you may know college athletics is a very big thing, right? So, and she was a swimmer. And she is very, very good. And she came second. And the person who won was somebody who until a year prior did the men's competition and now had moved to the women's competition, and she lost to him, and that is this person, Thomas is the name, see? So this was a person who was biologically male, transgender, then participated in sports, and that has kind of awakened this debate. Well, maybe we should do something about that in terms of athletics. Florida, again, Florida is in the news a lot. Have you noticed? It's probably the third time I mentioned Florida. Florida has a new law that basically prohibits teachers in elementary school from discussing issues having to do with sexuality, particularly LGBT issues, towards children. So again, it's a law, right? You see, it's a law. It's not just about whether you think it's right or wrong. There's a law being passed. In Florida, you have Disneyland, right, or Disney World, either one or the other, Disneyland or Disney World. And Disney has generally embraced the LGBT agenda. Disney has a special tax status. And now the governor says, we're going to take away your special tax status if you don't change, your attitudes and your opinions about LGBT. Another important issue is criminal justice reform. Criminal justice reform relates probably closely to racial injustice in the United States. The United States has more people in prison than any other country in the world, by far, like hundreds of times more, even per capita, right? So we should reform it. What happened after the reform? Well, people were being arrested for the 20th time. Suddenly, it's like they were too lenient on criminal justice. And that is what this debate is about. Another debate, very important in the United States, is this: guns. Gun reform is a delicate issue, I would indeed say mostly culturally, but also legally, because unlike abortion, gun rights are in the Constitution. Abortion is not mentioned in the Constitution, but the right to arm is mentioned in the Constitution. How race is taught in school. Have you heard of critical race theory? So there are basically now laws that say that certain theoretical positions in the sciences cannot be taught. That's this one. There's a lot to do about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Is there something comparable in Japan, maybe? Do you see that expression, DEI? Do you see that? DEI, DEI. That is very important. It's basically, it's about anti-discrimination policy. And it goes under this heading, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And there's a lot to do about that in campuses, but then there's also a movement against it as well. And there are indeed laws. Look, not good news for us, professors, because there are now plans on the way to end tenure. And there are some states where they want to terminate the tenure system. So obviously this would apply to public universities. There's a lot of argument about that. Very recent, this was an interesting one. There is a state where they want to display the 10 Commandments in a school. Do you know the 10 Commandments? Right, so it relates to Judeo-Christian tradition. So some people say you cannot do this in public schools because public schools are governed by the government and there is a separation of church and state. But there are some states where they're trying to do this anyway. So they're trying to bring religion back into the public sphere. To end it, what I would say is, why is it particularly important today? Remember that I said the study of culture has never been more important than it is today for the study of law and society in general. And the reasoning that I have is the following. If we look at the 19th century, what we can talk about mostly, not exclusively, is certain economic changes. The 19th century, that's when we went from, like in Japan, from a feudal society to a modern society, right? Like Meiji in Japan, and in Europe we talk about capitalism and industrialization, from agriculture to modern industry and so on. So when we talk about the 19th century, we primarily talk about, or we can primarily talk about economic changes. When we talk about the 20th century, we must talk about political developments. Economic developments too, but political developments become very important. Obviously, the 2 world wars, which you will know better than anybody else, right? And also, after the world wars, there was an expansion of democratization. There is also the formation of new states. But the 21st century, I would argue, is the century of culture. So right now, we are in a period where culture is even more important than economy and politics. And some of the examples have to do with secularization. Probably the most important one, I would say also from a Japanese point of view, is about globalization and localization. So it's about the extent to which nation states can, if you will, pretend that they are still sovereign, or the extent to which they have to take into account there's a world out there, that they somehow have to take into account that there's more mobility across people across the world, and that in that sense, in a way, if you will, that the world is getting smaller, but also is getting more important for every one nation to decide what it wants for itself. Okay? Thank you so very much. Arigato. Thank you.